We've already done the check with Zoom to make sure that everybody can hear us okay. I don't know what button that is. I don't want to touch it.
I think you're good.
Okay. Cassie, do we know that everybody on Zoom can hear us? Awesome. Sorry, I have no visual feedback from Zoom. All right. So just a reminder about Q&A. We will take questions at the end. If you are on Zoom, you can drop those questions in the chat, or you can raise your virtual hand, and Cassie will be monitoring that, so we can have your questions addressed at the end of the seminar. If for in-person questions, we ask that you repeat or summarize the question, answer it. That way the people on Zoom are in the loop. So with all of those business items taken care of, I will introduce our speaker today. Dr. Bethany Forseth is an assistant professor in the Department of Physical Therapy, Rehabilitation Science, and Athletic Training at KU Med. She earned her bachelor's degree in exercise and sports science from the University of Washington, La Crosse, her master's in clinical exercise physiology from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and her doctorate in health sciences from the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. Dr. Forseth is the director of the Behaviors for Family Health Lab, and her research is focused on promoting the health benefits of physical activity, as well as preventing and managing chronic disease through increased physical activity and reduced sedentary behavior. Much of this research is centered on improving health outcomes in individuals with various intellectual and developmental disabilities, and she will be sharing some of that work with us today. Thank you for being here, Dr. Forseth. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me and for that great introduction. So yes, I'm Bethany, and I'm talking today, I think it said health behaviors, but I started doing this or developing the presentation, and I really ended up focusing on physical activity and physical activity measurement, because health behaviors is also a lot, as exciting as they all are. So before I get started into this presentation, I just want to take a second to acknowledge all of my collaborators and mentors, and then all the funding from the projects that I'll be presenting on. So a brief overview of what I'll be going over today is my own personal background and why I'm able to do this sort of research. Hopefully I'll convince you on why physical activity and studying physical activity is important. And then talk a little bit about the physical activity measurement in individuals with IDD or intellectual and developmental disabilities. And then wrapping up of where we go from here and how to progress forward in our research. So a little bit about me. My background is in exercise physiology. Sorry, I don't want to see you guys. I'm just talking to this. And physical activity measurement. So when I got my master's degree at the University of Tennessee, they are big into physical activity measurement there. So trying to validate oxygen consumption, how many calories you're expending, and your accelerometers, and how many steps you're taking with your pedometers. And that's great. So I learned that measurement piece. And then I went on to Milwaukee and got my PhD in health sciences and really tried to integrate that promoting physical activity for that health outcome. But in order to assess that physical activity and health outcome, you really need accurate and valid measures of physical activity. So just so we're on the same page, there are physical activity recommendations both for kids and adults. And a lot of what I'll be presenting today is geared towards kids and research in kids. But just a reminder for all the adults online and the person in the audience, we should get physical activity too. It's good for us. So I'll talk a lot about MVPA, or moderate to vigorous physical activity intensity. And so that is when you are being active, you're starting to bring your heart rate up, maybe breaking a little bit of a sweat, and it's hard to carry on a conversation comfortably. And that looks different. That can look different in kids and adults. Kids aren't necessarily going to go out on a 5-mile run or go lift weights, but they might play tag, or they might have other fun games that they engage in, whereas adults have more structured exercise. And then on the opposite end of physical activity is sedentary behavior, or seated or laying activities. And we used to have this screen time recommendation of no more than 2 hours of screen time a day. And that was really more like TV time, not including homework time for kids. But recently, the American Academy of Pediatrics changed that. So they recommend developing a plan between your primary care provider and families to reduce screen time and limit that behavior. but just limiting the screen time and or sedentary behavior in general is good as well. And then putting this in a context of children with IDD, the research is, I'll talk about it in a second, but it's really rough to get a handle of like how much activity kids are actually doing. But the estimates right now are about children with IDD get about 9 to 14 minutes of activity a day. And regardless of where we are in the research, that's a little bit of a ways away from that 60-minute recommendation. And not that kids with typical development are getting the full 60 minutes either, which is also a problem, but we have a long way to go on this. So why do we even care about physical activity? On the screen are the top 10 leading causes of death in the United States for 2020, and 6 of them are positively impacted by physical activity, whether that is delaying or delaying the onset of that disease or helping in that management and treatment of the disease. And in addition to all of these on the screen, we also see benefits for a host of other comorbidities of these, including weight. And so a lot of those comorbidities or a lot of these chronic diseases have a higher prevalence in individuals with IDD. So in 2020, I worked with Dr. Lauren Tomey, and we presented data from the KU Med electronic medical record, the Huron data set, and we pulled out individuals with IDD. We had kids and adults in the paper. Again, I'm presenting on kids just to keep this focused. And so we broke those IDD categories into Down syndrome, autism, and then other IDDs. And we had just over 1,300 kids in the group. And so we saw here that children with autism and Down syndrome had a higher percentage of those had overweight or obesity compared to the IDD population. And kids with typical development usually are around 33% as well. So similar to the IDD, but a lot lower than the Down syndrome autism. And so that weight status, very, very briefly and broadly and a little bit crudely, physical activity can help improve or support a healthy weight. It's one of the components of supporting healthy weight, along with comorbidities. And then children with these higher weight statuses then have associated with more health conditions such as sleep apnea, hypothyroidism, hypertension, which again, physical activity can also help with those, especially like a hypertension here. So physical activity, improving that weight status, and then also all the comorbidities again associated with this. So why are we studying these health behaviors, especially and why is it so important in the IDD population? So I originally got into working with children with Down syndrome and spina bifida during my graduate studies. I was part of a pilot project, and the PI, Michelle Pulfis, was really interested in looking at the energy expenditure of these kids because they have such higher prevalence of overweight and obesity. And so trying to figure out what's going on and how to best support them. My screen just went black. Is everything okay? Okay, great. Awesome. Just double checking. And so again, this goes back to like the very, very basic idea and principle of weight, maintaining your weight of energy in equals energy out. There is a lot of other research showing a lot of other factors in there, but this is the basic principle. Just go with that. So energy in is all the food that you're consuming. Energy out is all the activity and calories that you're expending. And so the belief here is that children with Down syndrome or spina bifida had underlying pathology that impacted their energy expenditure. So we recruited 36 children, grouped them by diagnosis status. You can see it on the screen. And then we gave them doubly labeled water, which is just a beverage where you consume that beverage, and then we take your urine or saliva samples and can see how much energy you're expending or how many calories you're expending each day over the period of a few weeks. And so on the screen, we have on the y-axis that total energy expenditure, so calories per day. And on the x-axis, it's the fat-free mass in kilograms. And those are two very highly correlated values. So you would expect individuals with the same fat-free mass to have very similar total daily energy expenditures. But you can see with when you group this based on diagnosis that our children with spina bifida and Down syndrome were expending 500 fewer calories each day compared to their counterparts who were typically developing. So it tells us there that something's going on where they're spending less calories, which if they're have the same dietary recommendations, they might, and they're eating the same amount as being recommended, that might be too much for them. Again, throwing off that equation of the energy in equals energy out. Yes. So this was our kind of first study into this, and the hope of this initial pilot was that Michelle Pulfus was hoping to essentially validate some physical activity measurement methods with this double labeled water. But I learned in this process that that's not easy. Just within this sample or within these kids, we just don't have those sorts of measurement methods. So this total daily energy expenditure from double labeled water tells us how many calories someone is burning, but it doesn't say, oh, they burned so many calories because they were active for 30 minutes or because they're only active for 5 minutes. That's why we're seeing this lower energy expenditure. So it can't tell us anything about the actual physical activity. So again, the interest here is in physical activity and how physical activity can improve health. So ways to look and measure physical activity are through subjective and objective measures. And again, without those reliable methods of assessing physical activity, we just aren't able to accurately assess that relationship between physical activity and health, especially in these populations with IDD who might be more at risk for these health complications. So a lot of us are probably familiar, but subjective measures are reported by participants. They're very appealing to researchers because they are cost effective and typically easy to administer, but they have some recall bias in there. And then the objective measures are measured by a device with no participant recall bias or input, I guess we'll say. So again, in that pilot study, we were hoping initially to validate some measures of physical activity. And so we ended up turning this into looking at the feasibility of a self-reported or a reported activity diary. So we had participants, because again, this is in children, the participants' parents report their physical activity or all their activities during the day. So this, as I'm sure you can see on the screen, you might have an idea of how this study turns out for the feasibility and acceptability aspect. So on the screen, the far, what is this, left-hand column is starting at 6 a.m. and then the end on the right ends at 6 a.m. the following day. And then we have 20 of common activities are completed by children throughout the day. And then within each 15-minute increment, we asked the person filling this out to put a little X of what activity their child was doing. We also gave this to children who were over 13 years old and asked them to self-report their activity as well. So again, this is small on the screen because it's also small on paper. So what did we find out from this? It was feasible to have parents and children complete this survey. So the majority of parents, almost all the parents and children turned these back in, and they were able to account for 80% of time during the day, which was great. However, they hated it. So I maybe wouldn't recommend this to everyone. But again, you can see how tedious it was of marking every 15 minutes down. And I will add a caveat in here. So again, this was handed out to children who were at least 13 years old, but parents of 2 children with Down syndrome said that this probably wasn't a good task for their child, and so we didn't provide it to them. So it's always that caveat of know your audience and know your targeted population for what you're trying to get, because you're not always going to be able to get the ideal amount of data on kids with IDD. And again, we had wanted to try to validate this activity by matching all of the activities listed on the left with METs from the physical activity compendium, or like type of energy expenditure. But because of our main findings in the study that energy expenditure differed between our kids of typical development and kids with IDD, we're worried to match those up. And there's other complications like the kids' physical activity compendium doesn't include all these activities. So yeah, go ahead. These, yeah. So the question was looking at, or when do people know when to record this? So they were given 7 of these surveys and told to complete them every day. So the day following the study visit, they'd start at 6 a.m. and record. And so they didn't have prompts to say, oh, like remember to like mark your 15 minutes. So they could have gone back, and we don't have any way to check this of seeing if they actually were doing what they said they were doing during that time, or how active or inactive they were at that time. So again, that's very burdensome to think every 15 minutes I need to be filling out this gosh darn survey. And there are other surveys out there, but this is the one that we used. And so a really appealing way to assess physical activity is through objective measures. And one of the most common ones is through accelerometers. And so if you're not aware, accelerometer is very similar to a Fitbit or a Garmin or something like that. You put it somewhere on your body, usually a wrist or a waist. You can also put it on the ankle or on your neck. And essentially captures your body movement. And we turn that into data that you can actually analyze by having cut points, or like a range of intensities for the counts or the output. And so you can say, okay, well, Bethany wore this accelerometer for 2 days, and she had this many minutes in moderate to vigorous physical activity intensity and this many minutes in a sedentary intensity. And that's great. And those cut points are valid and reliable in the populations that they're validated in, which duh, but a lot of those populations they're validated in are adults who are very healthy, or children who are healthy and typical development and a normal gait pattern. But even in all those individuals, intensity level can vary between populations and between individuals. So we can put an accelerometer on a college age student and my grandma who's like 80 years old and say, okay, go walk on a treadmill at a 4 mile an hour pace. That's going to be pretty easy for that college age student. But for my grandma, that's probably a very brisk walk for her. She's going to have a higher heart rate and higher intensity. But the accelerometer is going to measure that the exact same and say it's the same intensity for individuals. So when we apply these accelerometers and these cut points to individuals with IDD, Down syndrome, spina bifida, or autism, those individuals, it might not accurately reflect their own personal intensities or individual intensities, which is just a problem in the accelerometer field in general. But a lot of individuals and researchers who work with these IDD populations don't always know the caveats to this huge conflict potentially in the physical activity measurement area. So then beyond all these intensity, or all these like complications and measurement problems, when we actually look at the research done in the IDD population, the protocols vary a lot. So people use different cut points and then they report their findings, which is great, but then you can't always compare those cut points to each other. It's like apples to oranges, which is why I published a study looking at essentially comparing those cut points to each other, just to point out, or to help educate researchers in this IDD area that not all cut points are the same. And this was really developed because I just kept having conversations with individuals at conferences who had said, oh, well, whoops, we just picked a cut point, which is great, but no one was picking the same cut points. And the research is very much everywhere. So to help prove this point, we collected this data, we pulled data from other studies. So we had participants who were adolescents with Down syndrome. They wore the accelerometer for 7 days. We had 37 participants complete this, and we compared 4 different cut points. So again, this is a problem even in the typically developing population, but I just wanted to help point this out to the researchers within the IDD population. So the McGarity cut points, that first cut point up here, was actually developed for an IDD population. And the researchers validated this based on direct observation, which is great. But so essentially, if a child was like running around, they said, okay, great, this is moderate to vigorous physical activity intensity. The child sitting down said, great, that's sedentary behavior. But the problem with the direct observation is that you don't see the physiology going on. And if children with Down syndrome, autism disorder, other IDDs have a altered physiology, we can't actually capture that. Whereas these other cut points, the Evenson, Friedson, and Ramzini, were all validated based on physiology, but on physiology of typically developing children. So we got a lot going on here. The Evenson cut points, yeah, do you have a question? No.
Just real quickly, what are the units for actually?
These are counts per minute. Counts per minute is the units up on the screen. Yes. No. So yes. So that's just what the accelerometer output is. It's counts or counts per minute. Yes. Yes. Yep. So if I'm standing still, I probably have like a 0 count. Or if I'm sitting, I probably have a 0 count. Or if I'm like running, I don't know, a high like 2,000 count.
I guess I understand that it's scale.
Yeah.
With movement.
Yes.
I'm understanding whether it's measuring the velocity of movement or whether.
Oh, you're testing me so much.
I
Yeah, I think
I'm fascinated by this technology.
I think it's a velocity and like a gravity. Oh, no one on the line test me. Yes. And these are like a 3 vector or 3 axes. So it's moving, but looking at the body across all axes.
Probably a combination.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't remember. I'm sorry. I should have brushed up on like early definitions of accelerometers. So again, these are in counts per minute. All these measures up here. And so these ranges, so the McGarrity range, the sedentary range is a lot bigger. So we expect more time to be captured in this sedentary behavior within this McGarrity cut point compared to the other 3. And then the MVPA for the McGarrity cut point is a lot lower. So we expect more time to be captured in that because it might be, well, it's a lower cut point. So you don't have to move as fast or work as hard to get to that level. So when we actually analyze the data, again, this is the exact same 37 participants over the exact same days. The only thing we did was assess this with the different cut points. So we see the McGarrity cut point had the highest sedentary behavior, which we expected to see around 10 hours, compared to the Evenson-Friedson, which were the lowest sedentary behavior, which was about like 7.5 hours. So like that 2.5, 3 hour difference is huge when we're trying to have interventions that are limiting sedentary behavior. And then we look at the MVPA. Again, the McGarrity cut points, we expected to see that be the highest. We had an average of 77 minutes per day at MVPA compared to the other cut points, which were like low teens, which again, if you have some studies that are using the McGarrity cut points and some that are using the Evenson cut points, you can't really compare those studies very well. You don't really know how much activity someone's actually getting. Are they actually getting that 16 minutes that you're reporting? Or are they getting the 77 minutes per day? And then just to kind of even break it down a little more simply, this is the final row is that number in the sample who are actually meeting the physical activity recommendations by that cut point. So over 60% based on the McGarrity cut points, were meeting the physical activity guidelines compared to 1 maybe in the other cut points. So again, a huge variation when you're trying to assess how much activity are people getting, are they actually meeting these guidelines or not? So again, the point of this was just to kind of show that you can't always compare studies to each other, even if they're just using accelerometers broadly. You have to really look at the methodology of how they're analyzing this data. And really, ultimately, we need cut points for accelerometers that are based on, that were validated based on physiology within these populations. So it's actually appropriate for them. We know that this is actually their intensity that they're working at and how much activity they're actually getting. Which then, so with that in mind, I was like, okay, I can do this. So I took a small chunk and attempt at this. So I worked to validate just the sedentary cut points in kids with IDD. So again, this is based on the initial pilot study. I'm showing data from kids with Down syndrome and those who are typically developing. So to validate protocols, again, you need this physiologic gold standard, and then also the wearing of whatever you're measuring. So we had kids come into the lab they wore a cosmed, which measures your oxygen consumption. So you can see like how much energy you're expending in that process. And they also then wore accelerometers. So we had that 7-minute protocol, and then they went out into their normal life, and I had them wear the accelerometers for another 14 days after that. So the part 1, the validation within the lab. Oops, I lied. I updated that slide. So you can see on the second half or the lower half of the table, our average counts per minute value were like 0.5 to 2, which doesn't really tell us a whole lot. But remember, the ranges that we're looking at for the even sync cut points are 0 to 100. So as long as they were below 100, that counts as good. But this average value, I think the protocol that we use 5 or 15-second epochs. I never remember which one it is for even-syn. So really, every 5 to 15 seconds, it's collecting data, or we're using that data. And so if you have like a few 15-second values that are above 100, what does that mean? Does that mean that average over time, yeah, that's great, but like, will that 15 seconds be counted as MVPA then? So I also wanted to look at that CPM, the counts per minute range. So how high did that counts per minute go as they were just sitting there, potentially wiggling around? And so that range in the kids with Down syndrome was 0 to 39. And the range in the kids without Down syndrome was 0 to 68, which is great. It means that everyone is under 100, which is a good start. And then the average MET value, that bottom row, is essentially their energy expenditure. It's another unit of energy. And for a sedentary behavior, we want that to be below 2 METs, which was great. It fit for both of these in both samples, 1.55. So great. So we have our counts matching, our METs are meeting our criteria. This is valid in a very, very small sample. Just remember that going into this. So then we wanted to look at that, or I wanted to look at their physical activity or the sedentary behavior patterns over 2 weeks. And so there's a lot more interest nowadays. So maybe like a decade ago, maybe more than that, there was an interest in sedentary behavior. And is sedentary behavior independently associated with these cardiometabolic health outcomes, independent of physical activity? And yes, it is. So then what about the sedentary behavior is so bad for you? And so people now are looking more into different patterns of behaviors. So your bouts, how long are you sitting down? Is sitting down for 5 minutes as bad as sitting down for 60 or 30 minutes? Spoiler, sitting down for longer is worse for your health. People are also looking at a bunch of other patterns like breaks and median bout durations, but this study just looked at the bouts. So we can see that percent of sedentary time spent during the day in the kids with Down syndrome was at 56%, and the kids without Down syndrome was at 48%, which is a pretty large difference. And then when we actually look at the data of that and the values, that top row in that table 3 shows that that's about 100 minutes of a difference. So kids with Down syndrome are getting 100 more minutes of sedentary time each day compared to their peers without Down syndrome, which is significant. And then when we started looking at breaking down these bouts, they were pretty similar. Again, this is a small sample. But the biggest differences we saw was in the 30 to essentially 60-minute bouts. Kids with Down syndrome are getting 1 more of those a day. And again, those ones have the adverse relationship with your cardiometabolic health, putting you at a higher risk for so many health risks that these kids already have elevated risk for. And then they get about a half about more of the 60 to 90-minute bouts. So that pretty much comes into our 100 minutes a day. But this wasn't statistically significant, but clinically, this is a large difference. And that's when stats don't always show you the whole picture. Okay, great. Bethany, you just told us that we need to be active, that there's no great valid measures for assessing physical activity in these IDD populations, but this is really important to understand because these kids are at higher risk for all these cardiometabolic diseases. Where do we even go from here? So two takeaway points with this. So I want us to take away that we do need valid and reliable measures, and that even without these great measures, we still need to be promoting activity in kids, specifically in IDD, but probably in everyone, including people in this room. A plug. So great. So to the point of we need valid and reliable measures. There are individuals here at KU Med who are working to create or validate cut points. This I think is mostly being done in adults with Down syndrome, but people are working on this. So if you're interested in working, I can definitely connect you to those researchers. And again, I think creating awareness of these measurement issues within the IDD research community is really important. Researchers are great at knowing their own special area of interest. And that's why you need to collaborate and just be aware of what measures you're actually looking at and how you're actually assessing and analyzing your data and what you're actually communicating to whatever population you're communicating with, other researchers or your clinical populations. And in that effort, I just want to be a support for researchers in this area. If you ever have questions or you're like, gosh, Bethany, you said a lot and I don't quite get this and I need help, feel free to email me anytime and I can either help you or connect you with people who are smarter than I am. So then again, even without these valid and reliable physical activity measures, we still need to be promoting physical activity. I think that's very important because we know that in all populations, physical activity is very important for health. So individuals with IDD or anyone will still receive benefits of physical activity, even if we can't accurately measure it. And we are seeing that children with IDD often engage in lower levels of activity than their counterparts. Although all kids are engaging in low levels of activity. So work on it for everyone. So how do we actually promote this promote activity in children with IDD specifically? There's a handful of ways, and these are taken a lot from the literature looking at qualitative data on like barriers and facilitators. So promoting self-efficacy and gross motor development skills in kids with IDD. Kids with Down syndrome have a lot of things going against them sometimes, of the low muscle tone and just the different motor skills, and I didn't even talk about their gait patterns. But gait patterns is also a problem in measurement. But so supporting development of this and promoting self-efficacy and being active is going to help kids to be more active. Promoting playing with their peers. If they don't have peers to play with, it's going to be a barrier to the activity. A big barrier is a lack of transportation to places to be active. So again, supporting that transportation will help. Promoting time for recess and PE classes is a big one. Again, I know that's being cut across the board in all kids, but this is being cut even more in kids with IDD. And again, I'm a big advocate for health. Physical activity is important for health, but there is also research showing that within the classroom setting, small breaks of physical activity for kids with autism and other IDD can actually really help their behaviors and help the whole behavioral environment of the class. So it's important, yes, for health, but also for that whole classroom environment and for that individual, and probably for the teachers. And then promoting accessible facilities and adapted programs for these kids are also very important. One of my areas of research that I'm really working, getting more involved in is promoting physical activity through the parents and the caregivers. So it's great to tell kids to go be active, but their parents are going to control in some ways what they're doing. Can they run in the house? If they're not, can they go outside and play? Is outside not safe? Like, what are the parents really supporting their kids to do? Again, are parents being supportive and like driving their kids to go somewhere to be active? So really supporting parents and getting them on board with understanding the benefits of physical activity. And then also having parents model the behavior, because we know that physical activity is down in all populations. So encouraging parents to also reduce their sedentary time and increase their MVPA, because that is associated with their child's activity levels as well. So key points, here's your summary from the whole thing in like 30 seconds. So individuals with IDD have a higher risk for developing these chronic diseases, and a lot of these chronic diseases can be positively improved or impacted by physical activity. But we don't really know that full relationship because we can't accurately and in valid ways measure that physical activity to understand that relationship. So we need better physical activity measures, but in the meantime, it's still really important that we promote physical activity in youth with IDD. Thank you so much for your time and attention. Who has questions? Yeah, go ahead.
So, first of all, it was great. So if I'm understanding correctly, the slide that you had of 4 different steps.
Yeah.
I'm gonna interpret that optimistic.
Yeah.
So is this suggesting though that individuals with Down syndrome are essentially underreporting their activity if you think that the gold standard would be the actual change? Right, because you suggested that the 3 columns to the right, studies to the right, all of those, their cut points, for instance, all their cut points were lower, and they're based on physio. So then the McGarty study is based on objective. Is that correct? Did I get that right?
No, not quite. So we're looking at the differences between the cut points. So the McGarty cut points are based on the kids were playing and the researchers directly observed what they were doing. So the participants didn't self-report. The researchers said, okay, this child is being like every however many seconds, you say, okay, this child's running around being active. This is a X intensity, or they're sitting down. This is a sedentary activity intensity. So it's not self-reported at all.
Right? So they're saying like,
well,
yeah, like physiologically they're active, but they're saying now they're sedentary.
So I don't think we can actually show like which one is correct or not correct, because again, it's part of me wants to really support these McGarty cut points because they are saying, okay, the kid's running right now. Like I can see this. And so therefore they're working at a higher intensity, but we don't actually know. We can see their movement, but we don't know like what their heart rate is doing, how many calories they're expending. So in some ways it works, but I think for this population with the altered physiology, we need a little bit more information.
So, and I guess that's my real question.
Yeah.
Primary question.
Oh no.
Is there work ongoing that would get the objective rating?
So So I know in the physical activity field in general, sorry, the question was, are researchers working to validate cut points based on both direct observation and on the physiology? In the same, yep. And so I know that research in the physical activity field in general is working to do this, and they're moving away from direct observation so much as using like videos and cameras and pictures a little bit more even. But I don't think I've seen anything in the IDD population specifically. Yeah. Sounds like a great idea for anyone that's interested. Nose goes. Said nose goes. That would be a big study. Go ahead. Correct. Yeah. So the comment was along the lines of Fitbit has both can measure heart rate and that movement. So that might be a good option. It definitely is a good option. There's a lot of struggles to analyze Fitbit output. So when I get Fitbit and Garmin confused a lot. So bear with me with it. Try to remember which outputs are which. But yeah, you can't sometimes. I think it's the Fitbit has activity minutes per day, and no one really knows what that is because it's not actually, well, maybe Garmin or Fitbit does, but it's not going to match this activity minutes per day aren't going to match your accelerometer outputs of any sort. And it's like kind of like a moderate to vigorous intensity plus some light intensity activity. The sedentary behavior is also really hard to like accurately assess. So I do agree that it's a great option to like at that intensity level with the heart rate. But again, it's hard to compare like the Fitbit outputs to actograph at any level. But I think researchers are still working in that area a bit more. Yeah. Yes. The comment was that, sorry, people online need to have repeated. So the comment was that accelerometers or actograph is still the gold standard. And so research, needs to see that as well. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Two things. Well, one is, part of me is like, oh gosh, that seems really important to have these two measures together. But at the same time, I suppose not being in the field, I should also think about before people put out the accelerometers or even those measures, there should be some data on those relationships between what you see and what people are doing and the physiological. So perhaps that's part of this data around why people choose one measure or the other, or reliability.
Mm-hmm.
That was one thing I was thinking about this. Lots of questions.
Yeah.
But my question before was going to be, no, that made lots of things that I covered. But on the survey, right, the people that every 15 minutes, did they also wore the
Yep.
Yeah. So did you look at any comparisons to what people said they were doing and what the physiological?
So that was the initial hope of the study, to look at what they said that they were doing on the survey and then what their accelerometer actually said. But so you really can't see it on the screen. So the activities on the survey, it lists sleeping, it lists eating, lessons in preschool, physical education. So that's great. So like people know if they're like in class or if they're sleeping, but we don't know. But how do we on this? This example. So how do we distinguish on this? How do we give a value to recess versus being in lessons? And so that's where there's a physical activity compendium, and they have hundreds of activities in healthy adults where they measured energy expenditure. And they actually assign net values to so many activities. And they have this also in kids, but I think out of these 20 activities, it maybe included like 8 activities. And then we're able to kind of pull some ideas from the adults. So it just got very messy of like, what is our outcome here? Like, what's our ultimate like data variable? Like, is it minutes of what? Like the really active ones? Are we trying to look at METs? So we couldn't get this into a usable output or outcome. Yeah, go ahead. No, you're fine.
I think it shows the importance of galaxies measured
1000%.
really appreciate that.
Mhm. Ooh. That's a great question. So the question was, in the IDD populations, has there been research on the metabolic equivalents or METs? So I would guess that there's some data out there on this. Whenever you're measuring, yes, there's probably some data out there on this, but there's not like a massive compendium of all these different activities in this list somewhere that I'm aware of. I think at one point in time, they were trying to start building one, maybe for individuals with wheelchairs, maybe other disabilities, but I haven't paid attention to where that field is going and how far along they are on that. And so you can kind of piecemeal together studies that are looking at that, but it should be accurate and valid because it's collecting data on the actual individual and it's collecting their physiology. So in order to get METs, you're going to need that oxygen consumption or how much understanding like how many calories they're expending. Sorry, I'm using a lot of like nitty gritty terms. Yeah. Go ahead.
And maybe this is what you were asking, and I, like, when I think about, my, I don't have it on right now, my Apple Watch,
Mhm.
and how it's tracking the, data on different populations of people.
Oh, so the question,
Like you said, take an Apple Watch.
yeah. So the question is like, do all these different like commercial monitors have data on different groups? I have no idea. So again, so that wouldn't use like necessarily physiology. It might pull in heart rate, which would help. But this is me. I don't use a lot of technology, so I don't know when you buy an Apple Watch, do you put in your Down syndrome diagnosis? I don't think. Yeah, Apple probably does now. But you don't put in like all these different like health conditions that you have, and they say, okay, like this makes sense on like what's going on of why your output might or physiology might not match or does match your intensity activity output. Go ahead. Mhm. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. And I think like the physical activity field is really working to better get better outputs from all the different commercial watches or commercial monitors, but there are so many out there, and then each time they get updated, and there's new versions coming out all the time. So that's just an ongoing vicious cycle of trying to keep up. And then which one do you recommend, and which one are you measuring on? And even if the monitor doesn't change, the software can change. So So I think they are trying to get that a little bit more, but sometimes you can't even get that raw of data on the commercial monitors. You can definitely get it like on your actigraph accelerometers, and I think you can get it for Garmin. There's like a Garmin API, and I know researchers at Children's Mercy are working that in particularly developing children, of making that like a usable outcome and measure. But it's taking a lot of work. Yeah. Great. Yeah. So the question was for those, you guys probably saw it in the chat, like which accelerometer is best? So I would going with the gold standard say like actigraph accelerometers are best, but yes, there's that caveat of they're not supposed to get wet. I think they're like water resistant maybe, but like we definitely had a kid who their sibling pushed them into the lake, and I don't remember if we were able to save the actigraph or not. You'd like dry it out and like really work on it for a bit. And so that is just like a caveat of things, unfortunately, of having to deal with. So you used to always tell them to take it off, or take it off during water activities. Don't lose it on the bus. We, for these studies, especially in the small kids, we used like, what's that called? Like an amusement park wristband. So they couldn't take it off. It was like stuck to them unless they like cut it off, for better or for worse. And then sometimes kids would complain like, oh, this hurts or it's itchy. So you just put a sock around it. And I don't know much about commercial monitors. If there's some have to be like more water resistant, you would think, if people who are interested in swimming, but I'm not positive on all those. Was there a second part to that question? Sorry, I forgot. Covered it? Okay. Sweet. Yeah.
One question. What do accelerometers, how do accelerometers handle
What do you mean?
So if you have someone who is engaging in bring along, that's what.
So this is a great, these definitions I do know.
Okay.
So the accelerometer doesn't know, it just collects the data. So if the accelerometer is moving, it's going to count that as a movement. And then when you look at physical activity, the definition of physical activity is any bodily movement that expends energy. So that would, yes, count as physical activity, but it's not going to be a moderate to vigorous physical activity intensity, or moderate to vigorous intensity physical activity. So it's gonna be like a light intensity at best. But really, like, is the individual sitting down and doing this? Then that's probably a sedentary behavior because their energy expenditure is not likely getting over 2 meds for kids or 1.5 for adults. So the accelerometer would capture that. Physiologically, you're not going to see much of a difference. Yes. So again, the accelerometers don't pick up the physiology, but so the
For interpretation of it too, right?
yeah. It just don't ask questions. Yeah, no, you're fine. So like that, yeah, and that like it really does depend on like where the monitor is. If it's like collecting, where it's collecting that movement. It's on the wrist, so you're moving around a lot. Is it like on your hip? So if you're sitting there but moving your wrist, it's not going to catch that. Like if you're sitting and watching a movie and a scary movie and your heart rate's going up because you're terrified, but you're sitting down and your accelerometer is on your wrist or on your hip, it's going to see that you're sitting, and so it's not going to care about the heart rate, even though it's actigraph doesn't pull in heart rate. But yes. Yes, we did track medication use. I don't think we pulled any of it into these studies because a lot of these are pilots and it was a very small sample. But yeah, we tracked medication use. And yes, it definitely does impact your metabolism. It impacts a lot of the outcomes that we're interested in along with physical activity. So that's always a fun one to tease out. Yeah.
Do these things, relate to those categories of sedentary, like high physical activity?
So
Like that?
they are not grouped like that. On the screen, I'm like, I have to look in. So you could group things like that, but again, you need to have an idea of the intensity activity. So in this survey, they're grouped by sleeping, school or nursery, leisure time. So leisure time still includes homework, reading, watching TV, playing games inside or outside. And then also it groups it by travel and then just special. So if they take the accelerometer off for swimming, you can mark that. Or if it's a hard activity to classify, you can group it by that. So this is more grouped by the different domains of activity. So where people get their activity from. So in adults, it's like at home, at work, as you're traveling. So that was the thought process, I think, here with this. In kids was the different child domains. You could definitely group it based on intensities, but again, you need to have an idea of like what the intensity classifications are and how are you basing that intensity classification. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mhm.
I live in this not as active for health care in adulthood, and find out physical activity,
Yep.
it's a really hard to right that we want study, sensory aspects, services, so many for the forms, and I think for the degree still out is individual needs and see how that affects
Mhm.
lifelong health or longevity. And I'm wondering for your study, going to be anecdotally that how is someone thinking about the block to be for this population?
Yeah. So the question is really how to support families in really parents and caregivers in supporting healthy lifestyle behaviors. And it's hard. I mean, a lot of people work with these individuals. Nothing from my research directly stands out besides how just tired and stressed out the caregivers are. And so we're doing a study right now looking at caregiver stress in transition age individuals with IDD, so like 18 to 30. And caregivers are so stressed. They're stressed already. And on top of that, then stress is also associated with all these like cardiometabolic health outcomes, which is not great. So you're stressed, you're not being active because you're trying to spend all your time just to help these kids eat healthier diets, or you're just trying to help improve some other area of life. Um, and so really, we haven't found anything that's like a knockout of the park. But I think it's great to develop interventions. They're like, oh, as a family, like go be active, which is what I love. But you also really need to acknowledge like these families have a lot of stressors and a lot more time commitments, and they have a lot more doctor's appointments than maybe a typical family, which I don't even like the word typical family, but a family without a child with IDD. And so I think that developing interventions or programs that can support the adult or the caregiver and the child at the same time, but separately. There's researchers here at KU Med who've been doing research, and I think they did a parent and child intervention together. And then I think halfway through the intervention, like parents stopped coming, and they did qualitative studies afterward. And they said, "Hey, like, what's going on? Like, why aren't you coming?" And the parents were interested in coming, but the kids didn't want them there. And it was more important to the parents that the child is being active and staying in the study that promotes health behaviors than the parent continuing to go. So I think if the if you're taking care of the child and entertaining them and having some sort of support and a watchful eye on them and hopefully encouraging health behaviors, that gives some free time for the caregiver. And so an intervention we're doing right now is, okay, so if the caregiver has that free time, are they going to come and support their own health behaviors? Or are they going to say, hey, I have a free hour or two, I'm going to go run and do a bunch of errands, or just take a breather. And so I think it is really hard to support that. But I really think somehow targeting the family unit is going to be our best way to improve health behaviors in these populations and all of it collectively. So,
Right at time. So thanks so much.
yeah. Thanks, guys, for this discussion.